A propensity and openness to learn from God, no matter who the teacher or what the experience may be. That's the hard part right there. No matter who the teacher or what the experience may be. So basically rewording that, how open am I to what God wants to teach me through people that irritate me, through people that I think I'm better than, through people that I think I know more than, through situations that are really frustrating or hard. How open am I to learn from these things?
Welcome to Practicing the Practices. This is an experiential podcast, and our mission is not only to help you learn about the way of Jesus, but practice the way of Jesus in your everyday life. I'm Brad.
And I'm Casey.
And we're continuing our conversation today on the practices of a healthy koinonia. So quick refresher, koinonia is a term that we introduced in our last episode that describes the way disciples of Jesus relate one to another. It's often translated in your New Testament as partnership or fellowship or even shared. Casey, podcast partner, the Christian life isn't a solo act.
We are really meant to do this life together. And I think if we're not careful, the contemplative life, which is a lot of the practices that we talk about and the way that we practice the way of Jesus, it can become a lot of really reflective inward work without an outward connection to community.
Such a good point.
That is, a criticism often of the contemplative stream is that it just becomes a lot of navel gazing, you'll hear people say. But our goal is to be gospel-formed people, not just for our own betterment or for self-improvement, but for the glory of God and for the good of others. And so we need each other, and others need us too.
So if you missed our last episode, encourage you to go back because this is going to build on the core virtue of a healthy koinonia. And what we said was if you want to create and cultivate a Jesus-loving, a neighbor-loving, gospel-formed community, it begins with gospel-formed humility. And we say gospel-formed because Jesus modeled the way. He showed us. And so when we're trying to think about what is humility, we look to Jesus, his words, his actions, his essence, right? And this is incidentally the name of the network of churches that we're a part of. And in our little collection of churches, we define gospel-formed humility like this. We posture our hearts in the way of Jesus, who, existing in the form of God, did not consider equality with God as something to be exploited. Instead, he, Jesus, emptied himself, and he assumed the form of a servant. Humility of heart is at the heart of a gospel-formed culture, a gospel-formed koinonia. Our attitudes, our words, our ambitions are rooted in the heart of our gentle and lowly Savior. Maybe in light of our last episode, our grounded, right, even Savior. So Casey, here's our contention, that humility is both a heart posture and it is something to be practiced.
Absolutely. And one of the ways that we are going to practice humility and really focus in on today is the practice of teachability. And this might be a newer practice that you might hear teachability and think, that's a spiritual practice. In fact, it is. And we're going to talk about it today. The Spiritual Discipline Handbook has a whole section on teachability, and it's defined as a propensity and openness to learn from God, no matter who the teacher or what the experience may be. That's the hard part right there. No matter who the teacher or what the experience may be. So basically rewording that, how open am I to what God wants to teach me through people that irritate me, through people that I think I'm better than, through people that I think I know more than, through situations that are really frustrating or hard. How open am I to learn from these things? How teachable am I?
So when we talk about teachability, when we think about this as a discipleship practice, as essentially a spoke of humility. So if you can envision a bicycle wheel, humility at the center, and then this is an expression of humility. There are three main components when we think about teachability. We can call this a framework for teachability, if you will. The first is vulnerability. You see, vulnerability requires me to admit I don't know. And Casey, let me speak for the 45-year-old men in the world. We hate to admit that I don't know what that means or I don't know where that's at. A matter of fact, we will pretend that we know what you're talking about rather than admit I don't know. But vulnerability is really a humility to ask for help.
Wow.
I like to think of it this way, is that vulnerability is the garden where courage grows.
Well, when I think of vulnerability, the first thing that I think of is Brené Brown, because she is the person that
She's the vulnerability queen.
She is the vulnerability queen. She's the person who made this a buzzword. And she has such awesome things to say about the link between vulnerability and courage. Just one of the many amazing things she has to say about this. Society has taught us that vulnerability is synonymous with weakness, but it's just the opposite. Vulnerability is the willingness to show up and be seen by others in the face of uncertain outcomes. There's not a single act of courage that doesn't involve vulnerability. Think about that for a minute. There is not a single act of courage that does not involve vulnerability. She says courage starts with showing up and letting ourselves be seen. And if I'm hearing you correctly, Brad, letting our fact that we don't know be seen, letting the fact that we need help be seen.
And we'll touch on this in a greater sense here in a moment when we get to framework number 2. But we are sometimes really uncomfortable. And this is strange. And this is part of, maybe the dysfunction of our society. We're really uncomfortable with our human limitations. I often say to people, you're not Thor. For those of you who don't know, Thor is an Avenger and he's strong and powerful and all of that. But we have sometimes this tendency to feel like there's some sort of sense of, we need to self-validate. But what that does is it removes our ability to learn. When you say, hey, I need help with this, I need help understanding this, it actually paves the way for you to demonstrate humility through teachability. So Casey, help us, how might we demonstrate vulnerability just in kind of ordinary, regular life?
Yeah. In regards to teachability, here's how it might show up. And here's what it might look like on a really practical level. Realizing that you don't know it all and you don't have everything right. And the ability to say, I'm sorry, I messed up. Can you help me? What do you think? Or maybe to just say, that's helpful to me. That can be really vulnerable. It can be really hard to admit to people that we need their help or that we want to know what they think, especially if they're a person that maybe we really don't want to know what they think, or maybe we think, they irritate us or whatever. And then ask some of the people who know, this is a really hard one. I'm just going to tell you, ask some of the people who know you best how you come across. My husband has this question, what is it like to be on the other side of me? And he encourages people that he works with to ask people that they trust that question. What's it like to be on the other side of me? Am I open and teachable? Do I tend to instruct people or set them right? And how do people feel about disagreeing with me? Yeah. These are some questions we can ask honestly about ourselves without being judgmental of ourselves, but just being curious and honest. Yeah. Speaking of curiosity.
Well, before we get to curiosity, I'm curious if this has been your experience, play on words there. Oftentimes when we're in a larger group, vulnerability in this way is really hard. And I'm driving down the road just this week with my 9-year-old. And because it's just us, I think he's asking questions that he wouldn't ask in front of his brothers, who are a little older than him, who might be a little bit more academically inclined than him. But he says to me, Dad, what does stupidity mean? And I was like, oh, that's a great question. And I answered it, but I thought, in the quietness, he had heard that, but he was like, I'm not sure I understand what that is. And he was just okay to ask, what does this mean? To me, there is a sense in which if we, as we get older, can maintain the vulnerability of a 9-year-old, it will do wonders for us, not only in demonstrating and modeling humility for others, but it'll enrich our own lives. Well, as you mentioned, virtue number 2, if you will, a practice number 2 of teachability is curiosity. Curiosity really builds off of vulnerability. Curiosity, I think of it like this, that it's an enthusiastic appetite to learn and grow. It's a little bit of that childlike humility to abandon our assumptions. By the way, assumptions are one of the lids to teachability. When you assume that you understand something, it becomes like the kryptonite to curiosity and teachability. I've got a great experience in this. I was walking out of Home Depot a few years ago, and if you've ever come out of a grocery store or a big department store, and as you push your shopping cart into the parking lot and you exit the sidewalk, there's these little yellow pads with all of these like dimples, these little bumps, and it goes bump, 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 bump. And so I'm exiting the home improvement store, and I hit those bumps, and like some of the stuff that I had on my cart fall over, and I was really frustrated. And I just kind of said to myself, like, what moron, what idiot come up with the idea of putting all of these bumps at the end of sidewalks? I was just exasperated.
Yeah.
I just assumed that there was no legitimate, valuable reason for it. Well, wouldn't you know that at that time, this is several years ago, my young daughter is in the living room watching Curious George.
Great show.
It was my favorite childhood book. I love Curious George. And there's a scene where Noki, one of the plot characters in Curious George, is asking about the little yellow bumps on sidewalk. And it caught my attention. I'm like, what? And turns out it's a device to help vision impaired people know when they're about to exit into oncoming traffic.
Wow.
What was exasperating for me, because it caused my little box of screws to fall over onto the pavement, is a life-saving safety measure. But I had no curiosity, right? Like my posture was just, this is silly, this is stupid. Why would anyone do this? Well, curiosity is the willingness to say, I wonder what this might exist for. I wonder why that person might respond that way. I wonder why that happens that way. Curiosity is the garden where wisdom grows.
That's so good. It got me thinking about one of the life-changing phrases when you're talking to someone that maybe you're frustrated with or you're disagreeing with is, help me understand. I'm curious about this. Help me understand your choice to do X, Y, Z, instead of you did this and you're the worst. Instead of being in a posture of judgment, having that posture of curiosity is such an important piece to being teachable. Hey, I have a sports quote for you.
Yes. I love a sports quote.
This is my first time putting a sports quote in here.
I'm so proud of you.
It was just for you. It's John Wooden.
And that guy's got some amazing quotes.
Well, here's a great one, kind of relating to everything you just shared. Here's what he has to say. It's what you learn after you know it all that counts. So when we find ourselves in this place where we think we know it all, can we get curious and still be teachable even in those places? So thinking about what curiosity looks like practically as it relates to being a more teachable person, just being open to the Spirit doing something new, open to where the Spirit's working and what the Spirit might be doing, not assuming that we are aware of how God's going to work in our day, and just being really open to interruptions, open to what the Spirit might be doing. Being a lifelong learner, you talked about your experience with the yellow bumps. I recently entered into a posture of a beginner. I'm a fitness instructor. I teach yoga, and I just went and did a totally new style of fitness class. And it was amazing to me. That's honestly what got me thinking about teachability and being a lifelong learner. It's amazing the lessons that show up when you are in a beginner's place. Yeah. And when you're the one in the room, especially in a field where I'm normally the one in the room that knows. Yeah. Now I'm the one who the teacher has to keep coming over to help. I'm the one who they have to slow everything down for because I have no idea what's happening.
But doesn't that help you as an instructor? You're like,
Yeah.
all of a sudden your empathy for the new person
Yes.
returns, right?
It's just in so many ways, I think it made me a better teacher. I think it made me better at what I already am an expert in. And that's kind of what this quote by John Wooden was. It's what you learn after you know it all that counts. So that was a really cool new experience with just becoming a beginner. So being a beginner and embracing a beginner's mind is another way that this shows up. Yeah. And along that line, in any given situation, this is, again, a very practical way to practice this. Ask yourself, in any situation, what can I learn about myself? What can I learn about others? What can I learn about what God values from this person I walk past that's homeless, asking for, money on the side of the road? Instead of making a quick judgment, how can I get curious? How can I learn what God values from that moment? How can I learn something about myself or even about them? And then learning to ask good questions, getting curious about how other people feel, what their perspective is, and really asking what they think. So what is our third quality of a teachable person that we're talking about today, Brad?
Casey, the third piece of the teachability framework is receptivity. Your receptivity is your openness and your approachableness. So it's not just that you're actually open to feedback, but people perceive you as you're open to feedback or correction or for expertise.
Yeah, the Proverbs are honestly full of admonitions. When we look in the Bible for opportunities to see teachability at play, the Proverbs have so many admonitions to accept correction, to listen to advice, to seek wisdom. Proverbs 12:1, this one is in the Message. If you love learning, you love the discipline that goes with it. How short-sighted to refuse correction. I don't know about you, Brad, but I don't particularly love being corrected or rebuked. But the Proverbs tell us this is an essential component to teachability. Proverbs 13:8. This is in the Voice. A person who turns from correction faces poverty and shame, but one who regards constructive criticism is well respected.
So good.
Proverbs 19:20. Listen to advice and accept instruction that you may gain wisdom in the future. So that's just a few examples of the many times that the Proverbs especially admonish us to be teachable, to be open to correction, to be open to wisdom. And so this is really how this might show up practically. Here's a few things to just look for, ways to add this practice into your life. Finding freedom to resist being the teacher in social settings. Even in the places that you're the expert, what would it look like to listen to to defer to somebody else, to listen to what other people have to say? In the places that we feel like we have a lot of knowledge, and just kind of settle down and be more quiet and receive the expertise of other people, kind of elevate the expertise of other people. To practice active listening and resist the urge to compose what you will say while somebody else is talking, and really, really, truly listen to what other people have to say. Notice your impulse to let others know what you think.
It's good.
Choose to be silent instead. You know who is honestly the best at this in the whole world? Is my husband, Neil. You really always have to kind of wonder, what is he thinking? And I love that about him. He is so gifted at and he knows a lot. And he's a really wise, smart person, but he just chooses all the time to just kind of be silent and wait to be asked, or even to just defer to other people. And again, we already kind of talked about this, but get in the habit of asking, what's the lesson in this? What's the lesson in this? If you could just do that, you would become a more teachable person. If in every person you interact with, you could say, even your kids, your little ones, your babies, what's the lesson in this? You would become a much more teachable person.
So if vulnerability, the first part of our framework, is the garden where courage grows, and if curiosity is the garden where wisdom grows, our receptivity is the garden where we grow. Because we learn, we receive correction, we're open to evaluation, and that's a healthy and wonderful thing. So, Casey, typically at this time, I would ask you to lead us in a practice, and we're going to flip the script, and I'm going to lead us in considering how we might practice vulnerability, curiosity, and receptivity. Now, I love that you've got a quote here for us. God's kingdom is diverse. And when we engage with those outside of our own culture and experiences, our world becomes much richer. That's from Deb Coster. So the practice today, Casey, is going to be a challenging one. Right now, in these next few moments, or if you're driving, next time you come to a stop, we want you to text or email someone today. If you don't take action on it, this will be easy to defer and say, I'll do that someday. But I really encourage you, text or email or call someone today who's in a different generation from you. Maybe they're 10, 15 years older, 10 or 15 years younger. Maybe someone who's in a different social class than you. Maybe someone who's in a different kind of ethnic or racial group than you. Someone who's in a different spiritual realm than you. And that could be someone who you perceive to be much more spiritually mature. Or maybe you've been on the spiritual journey and there's a brand new disciple in your life or in your church who's just like brimming with zeal and enthusiasm. The point is, invite someone who is in a different space of life to coffee, to engage them in a vulnerable, curious, and receptive conversation. And Casey, this can be hard. 8 or 9 years ago, when I was preparing, me and my wife were preparing to adopt 3 African sons, I was somewhat aware, but not nearly aware as eventually I would learn, that there was some gaps in what it would mean for me to raise children of color in our world. And I remember one of the most awkward conversations I had was I said to one of my African-American friends at the time, Butch, who's just a gem of a man, hey, could I take you to lunch and ask you questions about what I don't know and what I don't know that I don't know? Can you help me think about what it means to be a dad to black sons? Wow. And I remember the anxiety of that. But that led to some relationship and conversations that have been so critical for me. So listen, I know this can be hard. So, man, ask God to give you a teachable heart and a will, like the courage to listen. And so you're like, man, what do I do when I'm having that kind of coffee? Well, here's maybe some best practices to think about your own teachability. Like maybe you start with a little bit of reflection. Maybe you think about a time that you had your mind changed or a position that you held. How did God form you through that change, through that experience? What lesson did you learn from that? Like to remember that can be a really kind of humbling, but also kind of bring back to the moment some of those things. Do some self-critique, some self-evaluation. How do you oftentimes respond when you hear an opinion you don't agree with, when you hear a perspective that isn't yours? Begin to kind of discipline yourself to kind of suppress that in curiosity, right? And so think, like right now, who in your life might have you not considered that you could learn from? Or who might it be difficult to learn from? Whose perspective might be really different than yours? What situations do you find yourself wanting to demonstrate some expertise? These might be the very people to invite to this coffee. To go back to the question that Neil often asks in work environments or in small group environments, maybe if you're having coffee with a friend or someone who knows you and experiences you, summon up the courage to say, what's it like to be on the other side of me? How do you experience me? Help me understand your perspective. So, who is that person? Send them a text. Send them an email. Be vulnerable. Be curious. Be receptive.
Well, I love that practice, Brad. And that sounds really vulnerable. It sounds really uncomfortable in a lot of ways, but it sounds like in your case, it was really helpful. And I'm sure gave you a lot of amazing things to think about and just showed such a posture of humility and teachability. So hope that that is an awesome practice for you all as well. As always, thanks for listening and practicing with us. To make sure you receive future episodes of Practicing the Practices, make sure you subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, this is Casey for Brad. Grace and peace.